In the canonical New Testament, nestled merely a breath away from the cataclysmic visions of the Book of Revelation, the Apostle Jude makes a terrifying theological proclamation. In the 14th verse of his brief, relentless epistle, Jude warns of a coming cosmic destruction, and to validate this apocalyptic terror, he does not quote the book of Genesis. He does not rely on the revered prophecies of Isaiah or the intricate visions of Ezekiel. Instead, the brother of James anchors his divine warning upon the words of a man who supposedly defied the absolute certainty of human death. He writes, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness." This exact phrasing is not found anywhere in the accepted Hebrew Bible. It is a direct, undeniable quotation from the opening chapter of the first book of Enoch. Jude, an author inspired by the Holy Spirit, according to Orthodox Christian doctrine, treated the prophecies of Enoch as absolute, unvarnished scripture. And yet, if you search the leather-bound pages of your standard modern Bible, from Catholic to Protestant, you will find a gaping void where this monumental text should reside. The Book of Enoch was deliberately, systematically, and ruthlessly excised from the Holy Canon. For centuries, the early Church Fathers waged a quiet but violent war against this specific manuscript. It was declared anathema, a dangerous piece of heretical literature that needed to be starved of copying and starved of oxygen until it faded into the dusty oblivion of forgotten antiquity. The men who structured the modern biblical canon looked upon the contents of Enoch and felt a profound institutional terror. They did not ban it because it was a poorly written fable. They banned it because what it described shattered the neat, manageable theology they were trying to build for a newly converted Roman Empire. The Book of Enoch does not present a sanitized, pastoral view of the ancient world. It rips back the veil on the antediluvian era, the dark, violent epoch before the Great Flood, and exposes a meticulously detailed account of an angelic insurrection. It gives specific names, ranks, and jurisdictions to the celestial beings who abandoned their designated stations in the divine hierarchy. The text speaks of the Watchers. In the ancient Aramaic of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the word used is irin, meaning those who are awake, the sleepless ones. These were not the comforting, winged guardians of Renaissance paintings. They were towering, terrifying entities of cosmic intelligence and immense destructive capability who descended upon the blood-soaked soil of Mount Hermon. According to the banned text, these 200 celestial defectors did not merely observe humanity. They actively corrupted the timeline of human development. They entered into blood pacts. They took human women as wives, committing a severe violation of cosmic law that resulted in the birth of the Nephilim, hybrid apex predators whose insatiable hunger nearly drove the natural world to extinction. But perhaps even more dangerously for the early church hierarchy, Enoch details the forbidden knowledge these watchers illicitly transferred to mankind. The angel Azazel taught the metallurgical arts of forging swords, shields, and breastplates, introducing industrialized warfare to a primitive species. Semjaza taught the casting of root bindings and enchantments. Hermione taught the breaking of spells, while others revealed the secret courses of the moon and the stars. This was a narrative of humanity being forcefully propelled into darkness by malevolent, hyper-intelligent tutors. It framed the wickedness of the ancient world not merely as a human moral failing, but as the direct result of a demonic extraterrestrial intervention that the Orthodox Church leaders found too catastrophic to leave in the hands of the common believer. The text painted a universe far too dark, with a veil between the physical and the demonic realms far too thin. So they buried it. They outlawed its reading. They let it vanish from the Western world entirely, confident that the secrets of the Watchers were permanently sealed away beneath the weight of ecclesiastical authority. But the earth has a way of refusing to keep the secrets of the divine. In the winter of 1947, within the arid, desolate limestone caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds shattered ancient clay jars and inadvertently dragged this forbidden knowledge back into the light of the modern age. Among the fragments of Isaiah and the pristine scrolls of the Torah, archaeologists found multiple ancient copies of the Book of Enoch. It was a mathematical impossibility for the Orthodox scholars to ignore. The very people walking the earth during the time of Christ considered this book as vital, as authoritative, and as terrifyingly real as the Genesis creation account in itself. If you seek the hidden truths of the ancient world, if you are prepared to look past the carefully curated doctrines of modern tradition and stare directly into the dark, unfiltered history of the Scriptures, subscribe and join us in this investigation. The question we must answer is no longer whether the Book of Enoch existed, but what precisely the bishops of the early centuries saw within its ancient pages that made them so desperate to erase it from the consciousness of humanity. To comprehend the magnitude of the erasure of the Book of Enoch, we must first strip away the paralyzing filters of modern Western religion. The contemporary mind approaches the ancient scriptures through a lens fractured by the Enlightenment and softened by centuries of sanitized theology. We have been conditioned to view the Bible as a pastoral collection of moral allegories, neatly categorized into ethical lessons to comfort a congregation on a Sunday morning. We look at the ancient world and project our own cold, mechanistic understanding of the universe backward through time. We assume that the men who walked the sun-scorched dust of the Levant 3,000 years ago perceived a universe governed solely by physical laws, gravity, and thermodynamics. But this is a fatal, anachronistic illusion. The patriarchs, the prophets, and the apostles did not inhabit a safe, silent universe. They occupied a cosmos that was fiercely alive, deeply dimensional, and saturated with terrifying, unseen intelligences. To the ancient Israelite, the veil between the physical realm and the spiritual realm was not a wall of iron. It was a membrane, fragile and constantly shifting. And the entities that operated behind that membrane were not the soft, ethereal, harp-playing cherubs born from the imaginations of Renaissance painters. They were lethal, hyper-intelligent forces of cosmic bureaucracy. The tragic flaw of modern theology is that it has inherited a flattened, two-dimensional version of monotheism. We have been taught a rigid binary. There is God sitting in solitary isolation, and there is humanity, with perhaps a few faceless angels serving as cosmic mail carriers. But the Hebrew Scriptures, in their raw, unfiltered, and ancient context, describe something far more complex and far more disturbing. They described a divine council. If you read the 82nd Psalm in its original Hebrew, you encounter a courtroom scene that shatters the modern concept of a lonely deity. The text declares that God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. The word used by the psalmist for these gods is Elohim. In the English language, we use the word God as a proper name, a specific identifier for the creator of the universe. But in the ancient Near East, Elohim was not a name. It was a realm designation. It was an ontological category indicating any entity that inherently belonged to the unseen spiritual world. The creator is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is the creator. By ignoring this linguistic reality, modern tradition has blinded us to the fact that Yahweh rules alongside a vast, structured hierarchy of powerful spiritual entities who were granted free will, territorial jurisdiction, and the capacity for catastrophic rebellion. It is within this colossal, terrifying framework of a populated spiritual universe that the true horror of the Enochian narrative begins to unfold, and it centers entirely on the darkest, most avoided passage in the book of Genesis. In the opening verses of Genesis chapter 6, just before the narrative plunges into the apocalyptic destruction of the Great Flood, the text records an event so bizarre and so cosmically repulsive that modern theologians have spent nearly 2 millennia trying to explain it away. The scripture states that when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took as wives whomever they chose. It goes on to state that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. These were the heroes of old men of renown. For the early readers of the scriptures, for the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for the apostles of the first century church, the meaning of this text was absolute and literal. The phrase translated as sons of God is the Hebrew Bena Elohim. In the context of the ancient Old Testament, this phrase never refers to human beings. It is a specific, rigid classification used in books like Job to describe the celestial administrators, the spiritual entities who present themselves before the throne of the Almighty, the morning stars who sang together at the dawn of creation. Genesis 6 was universally understood as the historical record of a localized cosmic insurrection. Spiritual beings descended into the material plane, willfully violated the boundaries of their assigned dimensions, and violently altered the genetic trajectory of the human race. But if you present this passage to a modern Orthodox theologian, you will almost certainly be met with a cowardly theological retreat known as the Sethite view. As the early Christian church moved into the 3rd and 4th centuries, it began to desperately seek the intellectual approval of the Greco-Roman world. The brilliant minds of the era were steeped in Neoplatonism, a philosophical system that demanded a strict, impenetrable separation between spirit, which was considered pure and good, and physical matter, which was considered inherently flawed and vulgar. In a Neoplatonic worldview, the idea that immortal, spiritual angels possess the capability to cross over into physical reality, assume tangible form, and engage in biological reproduction with human women was not just heretical. It was intellectually embarrassing. It sounded far too much like the pagan myths of Mount Olympus, where Zeus would descend to earth to sire demigods with mortal women. Terrified of being mocked by Greek philosophers, powerful church fathers like Julius Africanus, and later the towering figure of Augustine of Hippo, engineered a theological lobotomy. They systematically redefined the ancient Hebrew words to fit their new, sanitized philosophy. Augustine popularized the theory that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were not angels at all. Instead, he claimed they were merely the righteous, pious, human descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam. Consequently, he argued that the daughters of men were the wicked, rebellious, human descendants of Cain. Therefore, the great sin that triggered the apocalyptic wiping of the terrestrial globe was simply that good, church-going boys married outside of their faith. This explanation has been parroted from pulpits for over 1,500 years, and it is a catastrophic failure of logic, biology, and historical context. The Sethite theory demands that we abandon all textual integrity. Why would the union of a righteous human man and a wicked human woman produce the Nephilim entities described throughout the ancient texts as towering, unnatural, cannibalistic giants? If a devout man marries a rebellious woman, the biological result is a normal human child with complicated parents, not an apex predator of mythological proportions that drives the ecosystem to the brink of collapse. Furthermore, the text of Genesis never identifies the adjunas of men as the lineage of Cain. It simply calls them the adjunas of humanity. Augustine and the architects of late antique orthodoxy forced the text to say something it simply did not say, building a wall of tradition to protect themselves from the terrifying reality that the Book of Enoch was actively screaming into the void. The Book of Enoch was dangerous because it refused to allow this philosophical sanitation. It took the brief, horrific summary of Genesis 6 and expanded it into an agonizing, hyper-detailed historical record of the angelic rebellion. Enoch did not just identify these entities as the Watchers. It exposed the political and geographical mechanics of their invasion. It revealed that this descent was not an accident or a moment of spontaneous lust. It was a calculated, military-style mutiny engineered by a commander named Semjaza. The text details how 200 of these higher-ranking celestial officers descended upon the summit of Mount Hermon, a towering snow-capped peak sitting at the northern edge of the ancient region of Bashan. In the geography of the ancient Near East, the region of Bashan was universally recognized as the gates of the underworld. It was the epicenter of dark Canaanite cultic worship, later associated with the giant king Og. It was ground zero for the demonic. On the jagged peaks of Hermon, these entities did not merely make a plan, they bound themselves under a dark covenant. In the ancient world, an oath was not a mere promise that could be broken or forgotten. It was a mechanism of supernatural physics, a physical binding in the spiritual realm where the participants invoked mutual imprecations, sealing their fate to one another permanently. They chose to abandon their eternal celestial habitation for the intoxicating, visceral experience of the material world, knowing that their transgression would alter the architecture of the cosmos itself. To truly grasp the explosive nature of this text, we must understand that the ancient Israelites were not living in an isolated vacuum. They were surrounded, besieged on all sides by the colossal, blood-soaked empires of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians. These ancient empires possess their own complex mythologies and historical records regarding the time before the Great Flood. If you excavate the cuneiform tablets of Babylon, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish, you will find extensive reverence for a group of pre-flood entities known as the Apkallu. In Babylonian theology, the Apkallu were the 7 ancient divine sages who emerged from the watery abyss. They were depicted as hybrid creatures, part man and part fish, or winged entities possessing terrifying brilliance. The Babylonians worshipped the Apkallu as the benevolent bringers of civilization. According to their lore, humanity was ignorant and primitive until these divine beings descended and gifted mankind with the knowledge of mathematics, astrology, the building of cities, and the forging of weapons. The kings of Babylon, the architects of the ancient world's most oppressive empires, claimed their royal authority and their superior, devastating war technologies were directly inherited from these pre-flood hybrid gods. This is where the Book of Enoch transforms from a mere historical curiosity into a piece of lethal theological artillery. The Enochian literature is not a myth conceived in isolation. It is a brutal, targeted polemic against the greatest superpowers of the ancient world. It is a declaration of cosmic war against the Babylonian worldview. The biblical writers and the author of Enoch were intimately aware of the Babylonian claims regarding the Apkallu, and through the Book of Enoch, they looked directly at the empires of the East and delivered a devastating counter-narrative. The entities that Babylon worshipped as the wise and benevolent Apkallu were exactly the same entities that the Hebrews identified as the Watchers. Enoch shatters the Babylonian propaganda by revealing that the transmission of advanced knowledge to humanity was not a gift of divine grace. It was an act of cosmic terrorism. The Watchers did not teach mankind the secrets of metallurgy, the tracking of the stars, and the crafting of cosmetics to elevate the human condition. They smuggled illicit, weaponized technologies across the boundary of heaven and handed them to a primitive, morally infantile species, knowing precisely what the result would be. It was the ancient equivalent of handing nuclear launch codes to toddlers. Enoch details how the angel Azazel taught men to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, transforming localized, tribal conflicts into systems of industrialized, mechanized slaughter. He taught them the secrets of the earth's metals, introducing the concept of wealth, greed, and the hoarding of resources that would lead to empires built on the backs of slaves. The angels taught the women the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, and the wearing of precious stones, taking the natural human drive for reproduction and twisting it into a culture of seduction, manipulation, and commodification of the flesh. Other Watchers taught the resolving of enchantments, the cutting of roots, and the reading of the stars. They handed humanity the keys to manipulating the spiritual architecture of the world through witchcraft and astrology, severing the human reliance on the Creator and replacing it with a transactional, occultic system of power. This massive transfer of illicit data was a deliberate bio-spiritual weapon designed to accelerate human self-destruction. The Watchers knew that a humanity armed with celestial technology but devoid of celestial morality would burn its own world to ash. And standing amidst the ashes of this corrupted earth were the offspring of this unholy pact, the Nephilim. The giants were not merely tall men. They were an invasive species, an illegitimate, hybrid bloodline possessing an unholy mixture of human flesh and celestial spirit. Because their spirits were not authored by God within the natural bounds of creation, they possessed a ravenous, unending hunger. Enoch records that the giants consumed all the acquisitions of men. When the humans could no longer sustain them, the Nephilims turned against them, devouring mankind, consuming birds, beasts, reptiles, and fishes, and eventually turning to drink each other's blood in a frenzied, demonic cannibalism that soaked the earth in a trauma so deep it cried out to the highest heavens. This is the history that the modern church inherited and subsequently buried. The early theologians looked at the Book of Enoch and saw a narrative that completely dismantled their attempts to synthesize Christianity with the neat, organized logic of Greek philosophy. Augustine and his contemporaries wanted a universe where the ultimate problem was simply human moral failure, where salvation was a philosophical ascent toward the divine mind. But Enoch demanded the acknowledgement of a universe engaged in an active, violent, multidimensional war. It demanded the admission that humanity had been actively preyed upon by superior intellectual predators, and that the bloodlines of the ancient world had been corrupted at a molecular level. By banning the Book of Enoch, by stripping Genesis 6 of its supernatural horror, the architects of Western tradition successfully castrated the ancient biblical worldview. They locked the Watchers away, not in physical chains, but in the prison of human forgetfulness. They convinced the world that the demons of antiquity were just metaphors, that the giants were just allegories for greedy men, and that the cosmos was a quiet, empty place waiting for our philosophical contemplation. Yet, while the theologians of the Roman Empire were busy rewriting history to make it philosophically palatable, the ancient texts themselves whispered of a different reality. They warned that the consequences of the Watchers' descent did not end when the floodwaters receded. The physical bodies of the Nephilim were drowned, crushed beneath the weight of the deluge, but the immortal, illegitimate spirits trapped within those bodies could not die. The physical bodies of the giants were pulverized by the cataclysmic hydraulic pressures of the Great Flood, drowned beneath millions of tons of churning water. But the immortal essence trapped within those vessels was violently evicted, because their spirits were not authored by the Creator within the natural, ordered bounds of the cosmos. Heaven would not receive them. And because they possessed a celestial, angelic architecture inherited from their fathers, the earth could not fully absorb them into Sheol, the standard realm of the human dead. They became trapped anomalies of the spiritual ecosystem, severed from their physical hosts, but unable to leave the terrestrial plane. In the ancient Enochian paradigm, this is the absolute, undisputed origin of what the New Testament explicitly calls demons or unclean spirits. Modern theology often lazily conflates Satan, fallen angels, and demons into one generic category of darkness. But the first-century mind possessed a rigorous, terrifyingly precise taxonomy of the unseen world. Satan is an Elohim, a higher-ranking serpentine entity of the divine council who rebelled. The Watchers are imprisoned celestial princes, but demons, the invisible, desperate, parasitic entities that roam the arid places, seeking a physical host, are the disembodied ghosts of the dead Nephilim. They are the fractured, starving consciousness of the ancient giants, eternally seeking the physical sensations they enjoyed before the flood: gluttony, violence, and the consumption of blood. This is precisely why, when Jesus of Nazareth steps off a boat into the region of the Gadarenes, which, significantly, is situated in the exact territory of Bashan, the ancient stronghold of the giants. He is immediately confronted by a man possessed by a legion of these spirits. They recognize him instantly, not merely as a prophet, but as the supreme commander of the cosmic order that drowned their physical bodies thousands of years prior. Their terror is not abstract. They beg him not to send them into the abyss. It is the visceral panic of a bastard species remembering the apocalypse, staring directly at the one who holds the keys to their final destruction. But if the demons are merely the wandering ghosts of the children, what became of the fathers? The 200 high-ranking watchers who descended upon Mount Hermon did not perish in the deluge. Angels, as entities of pure spirit, do not drown. Yet, they did not escape the terrifying wrath of the divine council. To understand their fate, we must examine the epistles of Peter and Jude, two New Testament authors who relied so heavily on the Enochian tradition that their letters are practically incomprehensible without it. In his second epistle, the Apostle Peter addresses the judgment of these specific angels. He writes that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. The English translation utterly fails to capture the terrifying specificity of Peter's words. In the original Greek text, Peter does not use the word Hades, the standard Greek equivalent for the realm of the dead. He does not use Gehenna, the fiery valley of judgment outside Jerusalem. He uses a word found nowhere else in the entirety of the biblical canon, Tartarus. He states that God cast them into Tartarus. In classical Greek cosmology, Tartarus is not merely hell. It is the deepest, darkest, most inescapable abyss of the universe. A subterranean prison existing as far beneath the standard underworld as heaven exists above the earth. It is the mythical supermax facility where the Olympian gods chained the Titans, the ancient, towering predecessors of the divine order. By actively choosing the word Tartarus, the Apostle Peter is brilliantly contextualizing the Hebrew theology of Enoch for a Greek-speaking audience. He is confirming that the pagan legends of the Titans were actually distorted, mythological echoes of a terrifying historical truth: the rebellion and subsequent imprisonment of the Watchers. The Book of Enoch provides a harrowing first-hand account of this cosmic supermax prison. The text details how Enoch himself was taken on a terrifying celestial tour by the archangels, escorted beyond the boundaries of the known physical universe. He describes being brought to a place of ultimate chaos, a void where there was neither a heaven above nor an earth firmly founded below. It was a place of utter desolation, devoid of water or light. There, he witnesses a terrifying spectacle: 7 stars of heaven bound together like great mountains, burning with eternal fire. The angelic guide Uriel turns to the trembling prophet and explains the horrific reality of the sight. He states that this is the prison of the angels. This is where the celestial beings who mingled with women are locked away. They are not ruling in hell. They are not currently tormenting humanity. The highest-ranking mutineers of Genesis 6 are confined in a state of agonizing sensory deprivation, bound in chains of antimatter or spiritual density, awaiting the final execution of the cosmic decree. The execution of this judgment was not a quiet, bureaucratic affair. It was a violent, catastrophic military operation carried out by the heavy artillery of the divine realm, the four great archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. The Book of Enoch describes how the earth, saturated with the blood of the innocent and crushed beneath the tyrannical architecture of the giants, began to cry out. The souls of the slaughtered humans ascended to the gates of heaven, demanding justice. The ancient text portrays the archangels looking down from the sanctuary of the cosmos, witnessing the mechanized slaughter, the dark magic, and the absolute genetic corruption engineered by Azazel and Semjaza. They present the blood-soaked evidence before the throne of the Almighty, and the response is absolute, uncompromising devastation. The Most High issues specific tactical orders to each archangel, revealing the precise mechanics of spiritual warfare. Raphael is dispatched to neutralize Azazel, the watcher responsible for teaching humanity the forging of weapons and the industrialized arts of war. The command is brutal in its simplicity. Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Raphael is ordered to tear open the desert in a desolate place called Dewdale, and to hurl the fallen prince into the jagged, unyielding depths. He is to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, and to cover his face so that he may never see light again. Dewdale is described as a localized pocket of the abyss, a subterranean wasteland where the entity that once roamed the brilliant courts of heaven is now crushed beneath the weight of absolute sensory deprivation, awaiting the day of the great judgment when he will be cast into the ultimate fire. But the punishment of the commander, Semjaza, and his immediate cohorts is even more psychologically devastating. Gabriel, the archangel traditionally associated with strength and the delivery of divine decrees, is sent not to arrest the watchers directly, but to incite a war of mutually assured destruction among their offspring. Gabriel is ordered to proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and to turn the Nephilim against one another, triggering a massive global civil war among the giant clans. Michael, the supreme military commander of the heavenly host, is then ordered to bind Semjaza and the remaining watchers. But before they are cast into the subterranean abyss, Michael forces them to watch. They are forced to stand by in paralyzed horror as their beloved hybrid children, the monstrous beings they sacrificed their eternal standing to create, slaughter each other in a frenzied, apocalyptic war. Only when the last giant has bled out on the corrupted soil, only when the watchers have witnessed the absolute destruction of their unholy legacy, are they dragged into the dark ravines of the earth, locked away for 70 generations. For centuries, skeptics and academic theologians dismissed these accounts as the fevered imaginations of a marginalized, apocalyptic sect. They argued that the intricate details of the Watchers and the Nephilim were a late invention, a theological fantasy completely disconnected from the actual history of the Israelite people. But the arid, unforgiving environment of the Qumran caves refused to allow this comfortable delusion to survive. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were meticulously translated in the mid-20th century, scholars made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the academic world. Within the crumbling fragments of Cave 4, they found not only multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, but an entirely distinct, previously unknown manuscript that scholars have titled the Book of Giants. This fragmented, terrifying text is a direct expansion of the Enochian narrative, but it is told from the perspective of the Nephilim themselves. It is a psychological profile of monsters realizing their own impending doom. The scrolls detail the prophetic nightmares that begin to plague the giant kings, specifically naming entities like Oya, Heya, and Maui. In these terrifying visions, they see a great tablet inscribed with the names of every living creature submerged in water, and an angel descending from heaven with a blade of fire, cutting down a massive, ancient orchard until only a single tree remains, a clear, impending premonition of the deluge and the survival of Noah. But the most explosive revelation within the Book of Giants is the presence of a very specific, undeniable name. Among the list of the mighty Nephilim warriors gathered to discuss their terrifying dreams, the ancient Aramaic text explicitly names Gilgamesh, the legendary Sumerian king, the hero of the Babylonian epic, the two-thirds divine ruler who sought the secret of eternal life, is recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not as a mythic hero, but as an illegitimate, demonic hybrid waiting to be exterminated by the floodwaters of Yahweh. This is absolute archaeological proof that the authors of the Hebrew Scriptures and the surrounding texts were engaged in a deliberate, highly sophisticated theological war against the empires of the East. They were looking at the mighty gods and kings of Babylon and declaring, "We know exactly what you are. You are the abominations of Genesis 6, and your destruction has already been decreed." This war was not confined to ancient parchments. It left scars upon the physical landscape of the Middle East. Scars that are still visible today, if one knows where to look and possesses the courage to understand what they are seeing. The biblical text makes a chilling observation in Genesis chapter 6. It states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The deluge wiped out the original colossal hybrids of the antediluvian era, but the genetic corruption, or the forbidden rituals required to initiate it, somehow survived or were repeated after the floodwaters receded. This secondary outbreak of the Nephilim virus became the defining, overarching conflict of the Old Testament. As the Israelites emerge from the wilderness under the command of Moses and later Joshua, they are not merely tasked with conquering territory for political expansion. They are engaged in a targeted bio-spiritual extermination campaign. The scriptures obsessively document the specific, localized clans of giants inhabiting the land of Canaan, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim. The epicenter of this post-flood giant culture was the region of Bashan, the very territory surrounding Mount Hermon where the original Watchers descended. This was not a primitive, nomadic society. It was an entrenched, occultic civilization heavily fortified against the impending Israelites. The scriptures single out the final, terrifying monarch of this region, Og, the king of Bashan. Deuteronomy chapter 3 records that Og was the last remnant of the Rephaim. To ensure that the reader comprehends the sheer physical terror of this entity, the biblical author documents the dimensions of his personal bed, which was kept as a trophy in the city of Rabbah. The text states that his bed was made of iron, measuring 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in width. In modern measurements, that is a sarcophagus-like structure of solid iron stretching over 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Skeptics attempt to rationalize this by claiming it was merely a psychological monument, a king building a massive bed to make himself appear larger than life. But this ignores the brutal, literal reality of the ancient world. You do not build a 13-foot bed of solid iron in the Bronze Age as a decorative metaphor. Iron was a rare, astronomically expensive, weaponized metal. Construct a domestic item of that scale implies an entity of catastrophic physical mass and density, requiring industrial reinforcement simply to support its resting weight. Og was an apex predator, a ruler whose very biology was a monument to the ongoing rebellion against the cosmic order. The archaeological footprint of King Og's dark domain still exists. In the modern-day Golan Heights, situated in the ancient territory of Bashan, lies one of the most mysterious and unsettling megalithic structures on the planet, Rujmail Hyri, known in Hebrew as Gilgal Raphain, the Wheel of the Giants. It is a massive circular complex consisting of 5 concentric rings of unhewn basalt rocks, containing over 40,000 tons of stone, with the outermost ring measuring over 500 feet in diameter. At its exact center sits a 15-foot-high burial tumulus. For decades, secular archaeologists struggled to explain its purpose, attempting to categorize it as a simple astronomical observatory or a nomadic gathering site. But the Wheel of the Giants is not merely a calendar. It is a machine of necromancy. The architecture of the rings aligns perfectly with the summer solstice, but more terrifyingly, it is aligned with the rising of Sirius, the star heavily associated with the underworld and the entities of the abyss. Ancient Ugaritic texts discovered in neighboring Ras Shamra explicitly link this exact geographical location to the worship of the Rephaim, the spirits of the dead giant kings. The Canaanites did not build this colossal structure to observe the seasons. They built it to communicate with the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, to perform rituals of blood and sacrifice in an attempt to summon the Dite intelligence of the entities that perished in the flood. The Wheel of the Giants is a physical, undeniable antenna built on the corrupted soil of Bashan, reaching into the spiritual void to contact the imprisoned watchers. It is against this backdrop of mechanized occultism and genetic horror that the most controversial and misunderstood commands of the Old Testament must be viewed. When Yahweh orders Joshua to enter the land of Canaan and enact the Haram, the decree of utter destruction, modern critics recoil in horror. They read the commands to leave alive nothing that breathes, to wipe out men, women, children, and livestock in specific cities like Jericho, Ai, and Hebron, and they accuse the God of the Old Testament of executing a ruthless, primitive genocide. They view the biblical narrative through the sanitized lens of modern political warfare and ethnic cleansing. But this is a catastrophic misreading of the text. The command for total annihilation was never a general policy of foreign relations. It was highly targeted, geographically specific, and fiercely restricted to the precise locations where the giant clans were deeply entrenched. God was not wiping out human ethnicities. He was quarantining a localized outbreak of an apocalyptic contagion. The presence of the Nephilim genetics was a bio-spiritual cancer that threatened to fundamentally alter the human genome and permanently sever humanity from the possibility of redemption. If the bloodline of the Messiah was corrupted by the DNA of the Watchers, the entirety of the cosmic plan for salvation would collapse. Consider the psychological terror documented in the Book of Numbers when Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan to scout the territory. They journey to Hebron, a city that predates the mighty empires of Egypt, a city that was the ancestral stronghold of the Anakim. When the spies return to the Israelite camp, 10 of them are in a state of absolute hysterical panic. They do not report that the Canaanites have better bronze weapons or superior tactical formations. Their terror is ontological. They declare to Moses, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Modern religious instruction routinely emasculates this text, turning it into a pathetic motivational speech about overcoming the giants in your life, as if the Israelites were simply suffering from low self-esteem or a lack of positive thinking. This is an insult to the historical text. These Israelite spies were not cowards. They were hardened survivors who had witnessed the greatest superpower on earth, the Egyptian Empire, dismantled by plagues of cosmic horror. They had walked through the severed walls of the Red Sea. They had stood at the base of Mount Sinai while it burned with the terrifying presence of the Almighty. They were not easily frightened by unusually tall men. Their reaction in Numbers 13 is the visceral, biological terror of prey encountering an apex predator that is not supposed to exist. They specifically use the word Nephilim, explicitly linking the entities they saw in Hebron to the apocalyptic monsters of Genesis 6. They recognize that the nightmare of the antediluvian world had resurrected itself in the Promised Land. The comparison to grasshoppers is not poetic exaggeration. It is an accurate assessment of the physical and psychological disparity between a naturally born human and a hybrid entity possessed by the ravenous spirit of the Watchers. The Israelites realized that conventional warfare was mathematically impossible. Bronze swords and wooden shields are useless against entities that require 13-foot iron sarcophagi. This explains the obsessive, almost surgical precision of Joshua's subsequent military campaigns. If you map the conquests of Joshua and later the campaigns of King David, you find that they are not random territorial expansions. They are tracking the bloodline. Joshua specifically moves to cut off the giant clans in the hill country, in Hebron, Debir, and Aneb. The scriptures deliberately note that no Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. This seemingly minor historical footnote is, in fact, a ticking time bomb within the biblical narrative, setting the stage for the most famous, yet profoundly misunderstood, combat sequence in human history, the encounter between David and Goliath. When a young David walks onto the battlefield of the Valley of Elah, he is not merely a brave underdog facing a heavily armored champion. Goliath is explicitly identified as being from Gath, the exact city where Joshua failed to eradicate the final remnants of the Anakim genetics. Goliath is not just a tall Philistine warrior. He is the lingering echo of Genesis 6. He is the physical manifestation of the Watchers' rebellion, standing in the valley, mocking the armies of the living God. Clad in scale armor that perfectly mirrors the serpentine aesthetics of the Dark Realm. When David selects 5 smooth stones from the brook, it is not an act of naive faith or a backup plan in case he misses his first throw. The biblical text later reveals in the 2nd book of Samuel that Goliath had 4 giant brothers operating within the Philistine military hierarchy: Ishbi-Benob, Saiph, Lami, and an unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a classic. A chilling biological marker of severe genetic corruption and Nephilic hybridization. David picked up 5 stones because he was preparing to execute the final, absolute eradication of the Nephilim bloodline on that battlefield. He was finishing the apocalyptic war that began on the jagged peaks of Mount Hermon. The narrative of the ancient world is not a story of human political evolution. It is a sprawling, multi-generational saga of cosmic contamination and divine quarantine. The architecture of the ancient texts demands that we look at the ruins of the Levant, the megaliths of Bashan, and the crumbling scrolls of Qumran, and accept a terrifying reality. The human race has been hunted. The history we have been taught is a sanitized illusion, a comfortable fiction designed to protect our fragile minds from the overwhelming scale of the spiritual conflict raging across the dimensions. The early church fathers, steeped in the sterile logic of the Greco-Roman world, looked at the raw, bloody, terrifying mechanics of this war, the angelic mutiny, the hybrid predators, the mechanized destruction, and they flinched. They could not reconcile a God of pure philosophical love with a creator who had to drown the planet to cleanse it of an extraterrestrial virus. They could not accept a universe where the boundaries of reality were so terrifyingly porous. So they removed the Book of Enoch. They redefined the sons of God. They turned the terrifying reality of the Nephilim into a harmless allegory. But by amputating this vital organ from the body of Scripture, they inadvertently severed humanity's understanding of why the world is so fundamentally, incurably broken. They blinded us to the true nature of the enemy. Without the context of the Watchers, the cruelty of human history seems like an endless, inexplicable cycle of our own making. We look at the rise of bloodthirsty empires, the development of weapons capable of vaporizing millions, and the insidious spread of the occult, and we blame the darkness solely on the human heart. But the ancient texts whisper a far more sinister truth. The darkness was not entirely homegrown. It was imported, and while the original architects of that darkness may be chained in the deepest abysses of Tartarus, waiting in agonizing sensory deprivation for the day of judgments, the technology of rebellion they unleashed upon the earth did not perish with them. It mutated. It embedded itself into the very bedrock of human ambition, lying dormant in the silt of the receding floodwaters until the survivors of the deluge multiplied and began, once again, to construct the engines of empire. The Book of Genesis, acting as the historical anchor to the Enochian nightmare, records this immediate, terrifying resurgence on the plains of Shinar. Here, humanity gathered under the shadow of a tyrant named Nimrod. Modern Sunday school lessons portray Nimrod as a generic ancient king, a builder of cities who simply became too prideful. But the original Hebrew text reveals a far more sinister profile. The scripture describes him as a gibber. In the ancient lexicon, a gibber is not merely a strong man. It is the exact same classification used in Genesis chapter 6 to describe the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Nimrod was attempting to resurrect the antediluvian architecture of the Watchers. He was a biological or spiritual successor to the giants, and the monument he commissioned was not a mere tower of bricks designed to touch the clouds out of human arrogance. The Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, a sophisticated piece of occult technology. In the Mesopotamian worldview, a ziggurat was a physical gateway, an artificial mountain designed to puncture the dimensional membrane between the human realm and the realm of the Elohim. Humanity was not trying to climb up to God. They were trying to build a landing pad to bring the gods back down. They were actively attempting to re-establish the catastrophic contact with the celestial mutineers that had just triggered the apocalypse. They wanted the forbidden knowledge. They wanted the technology of the Watchers. The response of the Most High to the Tower of Babel is arguably the most suppressed, misunderstood, and poorly translated event in the entire biblical canon. It is a moment of cosmic divorce that fundamentally alters the architecture of the universe, setting the stage for the unseen war that continues to ravage the earth today. If you ask a modern theologian what happened at Babel, they will tell you it was a story about the origin of languages. They will say God scrambled the tongues of humanity to scatter them across the globe. That is the sanitized, pediatric version of history. It completely ignores the devastating theological reality preserved in the 32nd chapter of Deuteronomy, specifically in verses 8 and 9. For centuries, the English translations of Deuteronomy 32 relied on the Masoretic text, a medieval Hebrew manuscript tradition. In the Masoretic text, the verse reads that when the Most High divided the nations, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. This phrasing makes absolutely no historical or logical sense. At the time of the Tower of Babel, the nation of Israel did not exist. Abraham had not even been born. There were no children of Israel to number the nations by. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed from the Qumran caves, archaeologists found a manuscript of Deuteronomy that predated the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years. This ancient, uncorrupted scroll revealed the terrifying original phrasing. It stated that when the Most High divided the nations, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, the divine council. This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, the absolute bedrock of ancient biblical theology that the modern church has completely abandoned. At the Tower of Babel, Yahweh did not merely confuse human linguistics. He enacted a punitive decree of cosmic abandonment, because humanity had repeatedly demonstrated an insatiable, suicidal desire to worship the lesser spiritual entities and access the forbidden technology of the Watchers. The Creator gave them exactly what they wanted. He disinherited the human race. He divided the global population into 70 distinct nations, and he placed each nation under the direct territorial administration of a subordinate, celestial being, a son of God from the divine council. Yahweh stepped back and handed the jurisdiction of the planet over to the lesser Elohim, keeping only one entirely new bloodline for himself, which he would forge from the barren womb of Sarah and the seed of Abraham. This event is the origin of the pagan pantheons, the gods of Egypt, the gods of Greece, the gods of Rome, the towering entities worshipped in the ziggurats of Babylon Zeus. Apollo, Ra, Baal, Milcom, Chemoshis were not figments of the primitive human imagination. They were not statues of wood and stone. They were the actual, literal, highly intelligent, territorial Elohim assigned to govern the 70 nations at the Tower of Babel. But the Book of Psalms and the Book of Enoch revealed the horrific paradox of this divine administration. These territorial spirits, originally tasked with governing the nations with justice, became immediately corrupted by the intoxicating power of human worship. They went rogue. In Psalm 82, God convenes the divine council and indicts these territorial rulers. stating that they judge unjustly, they show partiality to the wicked, and they walk in darkness, causing all the foundations of the earth to be shaken. These entities demanded blood sacrifice. They instituted systems of slavery, war, and mechanized cruelty. They took the forbidden knowledge, originally taught by the Watchers of Genesis 6, and institutionalized it, turning occultic magic, astrology, and necromancy into the state religions of the ancient empires. The history of the world is not a sequence of human empires rising and falling through economic or military shifts. It is a sprawling, brutal chess match between the rogue, territorial Elohim, fighting for geographical dominance, using human armies as expendable pawns on a blood-soaked board. The spiritual realm is not a quiet, empty vacuum waiting for our prayers. It is a heavily fortified, highly hostile, occupied territory. When the Apostle Paul wrote his epistles to the early Christian churches, he was not writing as a mild-mannered philosopher. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, deeply trained in the ancient Enochian worldview. He understood the Deuteronomy 32 paradigm perfectly. When Paul writes in the letter to the Ephesians that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, he is not speaking metaphorically about the Roman government or human political systems. He is issuing a literal tactical briefing about the structure of the unseen world. Paul uses terrifying, specific Greek terminology to describe the enemy command structure. He calls them the rulers, the authorities, the cosmic powers of this present darkness, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The Greek word he uses for cosmic powers is Kosmokrators. In the ancient world, a Kosmokrator was not a minor demon hiding in a dark room. It was a planetary intelligence, an architect of global systems, a deity that governed the very mechanics of a geographical empire. Paul is telling the early church that behind the marble columns of the Roman Senate, behind the brutal discipline of the Roman legions, and behind the philosophical academies of Athens, there are towering, ancient, hyper-intelligent entities manipulating the minds of men to maintain an iron grip on their allotted territories. This paradigm completely obliterates the modern, comfortable Western theology that treats spiritual warfare as a psychological metaphor for overcoming bad habits or negative thoughts. The ancient texts present a universe where the ultimate danger to the human soul is not merely a lack of morality, but active, unauthorized contact with a predatory, superior intelligence. This brings us to the profound doctrinal paradox that ultimately led to the banning of the Book of Enoch and the suppression of the ancient worldview. As the Christian Church emerged from centuries of brutal persecution and suddenly found itself seated on the throne of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the institutional hierarchy faced a massive intellectual crisis. They were now the official religion of a vast, complex, highly educated empire. They needed stability. They needed a theology that was manageable, logical, and centralized. The Book of Enoch and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview represented the exact opposite. It presented a cosmos that was chaotic, multidimensional, and terrifyingly porous. It explicitly stated that the boundaries between angels and humans could be breached. The great theologians of the 4th century, men like Jerome and Augustine, looked at the Enochian texts and realized the devastating implications. If the Watchers could descend, materialize, and corrupt the human genome in the days of Noah, what is to stop them from doing it again? If the territorial Elohim are real, active agents controlling the nations, then the safety of the church is not guaranteed by the emperor's decrees or the bishop's authority. This was a level of existential vulnerability that the institutional church simply could not tolerate. But to maintain total control over the spiritual lives of the population, the church needed a monopoly on the supernatural. They needed God to be distant, accessible only through the approved sacraments administered by the ordained priesthood. They could not have a universe teeming with rogue deities, roaming Nephilim spirits, and celestial defectors possessing illicit technology. So they initiated a massive theological lobotomy. They dismantled the divine council. They stripped the Elohim of their autonomy and reduced them to mere messengers or generic demons with no territorial power. They took the horrific biological violation of Genesis 6 and, as we have seen, sanitized it into the Sethite theory. Boring story about good humans making bad marriage choices. But the most damaging alteration was how they redefined the nature of the forbidden knowledge itself. In the Enochian worldview, the teachings of Azazel and Semjaza, the crafting of weapons, the use of abortifacients, the cutting of roots, the casting of spells, and the reading of the stars were understood as actual functional technologies. The ancient Hebrews believed that magic was not an illusion. They believed it was the illicit manipulation of the fundamental code of creation. It was accessing the back end of the cosmic operating system using passwords stolen by the Watchers. When a Canaanite sorcerer cast an enchantment, or when a Babylonian astrologer mapped the constellations to predict a war, they were not performing harmless parlor tricks. They were engaging in a lethal, transactional relationship with the demonic realm. They were violating the physics of the spiritual universe. The modern church, influenced by the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, has entirely lost this understanding. Today, Orthodox theology largely dismisses the occult as psychological manipulation, sleight of hand, or mere superstition. We tell our congregations that witchcraft has no real power, that astrology is just silly entertainment, and that the only real danger is the moral failing of engaging in something unbiblical. This is a catastrophic underestimation of the enemy. The Book of Enoch warns that this knowledge is terrifyingly real. It is weaponized data. When an individual engages in the occult, they are not playing make-believe. They are sending a direct, localized signal into the dark architecture of the unseen realm, inviting the Kosmokrators, the territorial entities, and the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim to cross the dimensional boundary. The danger is not that magic is fake. The terrifying reality is that it works. It works because the Watchers brought the mechanics of heaven down to earth and twisted them into mechanisms of control. By erasing the Book of Enoch, the Church Fathers effectively disarmed the Christian worldview. They left billions of believers completely blind to the actual mechanics of the spiritual war. They created a profound doctrinal paradox. The modern Christian is commanded to put on the full armor of God to fight the principalities and powers. But they are simultaneously taught that those principalities are merely metaphors, that the giants were just tall men, and that the angels have never and could never physically intervene in human history. We are sending soldiers into a cosmic meat grinder equipped with nothing but ethical suggestions and historical ignorance. This theological blindness becomes even more alarming when you examine the bizarre, seemingly inexplicable commands found in the New Testament epistles, commands that modern pastors actively avoid or frantically attempt to explain away as ancient cultural quirks. The most glaring example is found in the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11. Paul is giving instructions on how the gathered assembly of believers should conduct themselves during worship, and he specifically addresses the conduct of women. He states that a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, and then he provides the theological justification for this command. He does not say it is because of patriarchal dominance. He does not say it is simply a cultural fashion of the first century. Paul writes that a woman must have her head covered because of the angels. For 2,000 years, commentators who reject the Enochian worldview have twisted themselves into intellectual knots trying to explain this verse. Some claim Paul meant human messengers. Others suggest he meant good angels who might be offended by breaches of etiquette. These explanations are pathetically weak and fundamentally misunderstand the mind of the apostle. Paul was heavily influenced by the Book of Enoch. He knew precisely what happened on Mount Hermon. He understood that the original watchers were violently seduced by the beauty of human women, leading to the apocalyptic breach of the cosmic order. When the early church gathered to worship, they were not merely singing songs. They were tearing open a localized portal to the divine realm. They were entering into the presence of the spiritual host. Paul's command was a direct, tactical protocol based on the trauma of Genesis 6. He was terrified that the veil between the dimensions would thin during worship, and the celestial beings, who are still observing humanity, might once again be tempted to break their assigned boundaries. The head covering was not a symbol of submission to men. It was a physical, spiritual barrier, a signal to the observing Elohim that this human was under the jurisdiction and protection of the Most High, and off-limits to celestial intervention. Paul was actively implementing countermeasures against a repeat of the Watcher invasion. This level of raw, supernatural dread is entirely absent from modern religious practice. We have domesticated the divine. We have built theological systems that try to compress the infinite, terrifying reality of God and His cosmic counsel into a neat set of rational propositions. But the suppressed texts of antiquity refuse to remain silent. They stand as a massive, immovable monolith, casting a long, dark shadow over our comfortable dogmas. The paradox we are forced to confront is that the very institution tasked with preserving the truth of the Scriptures actively chose to bury the key that unlocks them. The early church councils, driven by the arrogance of Greek philosophy and the desperate need for political stability, severed the root system of ancient biblical theology. They looked at the terrifying vastness of the unseen realm, the reality of the territorial gods, and the lethal legacy of the Nephilim, and they decided that humanity was too fragile to handle the truth. They traded the terrifying reality of a multi-dimensional war for the comforting illusion of an empty universe where the only variables are God and human morality. But erasing a reality does not neutralize it. The Kosmokrators did not vacate their thrones over the nations simply because Augustine decided they were metaphors. The disembodied spirits of the giants did not cease their ravenous search for physical hosts just because modern seminaries stopped believing in them. The illicit technology of the Watchers, The dark mechanics of the occult did not lose its potency just because the Enlightenment declared it to be superstition. We are living in the ruins of a sanitized worldview. We have inherited a theology that is fundamentally incapable of explaining the explosive, irrational acceleration of evil in the modern world. When we see global systems acting with coordinated, mechanized cruelty, when we witness the sudden, localized outbreaks of unexplainable depravity, we try to diagnose it with sociology, psychology, and politics. We use the tools of the physical world to fight a war that is being waged from the unseen dimensions. We are fighting ghosts with mathematics, completely unaware that the board we are playing on was designed by ancient, hostile intelligences who view us not as opponents, but as prey. The early church fathers banned the Book of Enoch to protect the minds of the believers from the terror of the cosmic deep, but in doing so, they left the gates unguarded. They convinced the world that the monsters were dead, and in the deafening silence of our rational, modern theology, the ancient entities simply changed their tactics, retreating into the shadows of our ignorance. Quietly continuing the dark administration they began before the floodwaters fell. When the disciples of Jesus approached him privately upon the Mount of Olives, sitting in the long shadows of the Second Temple, they asked him a question that has haunted the eschatological imagination of humanity for 2 millennia. They asked for the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. In his response, recorded in the 24th chapter of Matthew, Christ does not provide a vague, ethereal metaphor. He issues a terrifyingly precise historical parallel. He declares, with absolute chronological certainty, that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 4 generations. The modern, sanitized pulpit has completely sterilized this prophecy. We are taught that Jesus was simply describing a society characterized by apathy and mundane distraction. The traditional interpretation claims that in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, completely oblivious to the impending judgment, and therefore, the end times will simply be a period of intense human complacency. This interpretation is a catastrophic reduction of the biblical text. It is a willful ignorance of the Enochian worldview that the first-century Jewish audience inherently understood. When Jesus invoked the days of Noah to the men sitting on the Mount of Olives, he was not talking about catering banquets or the distraction of ancient weddings. He was invoking the darkest, most traumatic epoch in the history of the cosmos. The defining characteristic of the days of Noah was not human apathy. It was the apocalyptic breach of the dimensional barrier. It was the descent of the Watchers. It was the illicit transfer of celestial technology. It was the catastrophic, unauthorized hybridization of the human genome through the breeding program of the Nephilim. When Jesus stated that the end of the age would perfectly mirror the antediluvian world, he was issuing a devastating prophetic warning. The cosmic quarantine is going to fail, and the ancient incursion is going to happen again. The prophetic consequences of the Book of Enoch demand that we completely re-evaluate our understanding of the impending apocalypse. We are not merely marching toward a third world war fought over human resources, nor are we simply waiting for a charismatic human politician to establish a global government. The eschatological horizon is the stage for a localized, dimensional invasion It is the final violent convergence of the physical and the spiritual realms, where the entities that have operated behind the veil of human history will finally step out of the shadows and manifest their power in the open, unfiltered reality of the terrestrial plane. To understand the mechanics of this terrifying future, we must look to the Book of Daniel, a text written in the heart of the Babylonian Empire, ground zero for the worship of the ancient watcher spirits. In the second chapter, Daniel interprets the terrifying dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, describing a colossal statue representing the succession of human empires. The head is of gold, the chest of silver, the thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron. But it is the final, eschatological empire, represented by the feet of the statue, that carries a chilling, Enochian anomaly. Daniel describes the feet as a fragile mixture of iron and clay. But in the 43rd verse, the prophet uses a phrase that has baffled secular historians and orthodox theologians alike. He states, "As you saw, I am mixed with ceramic clay. They will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." The text presents a terrifying pronoun. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Who are they that are distinct from the seed of humanity? In the original Aramaic, the concept of mingling seed is an explicit biological reference to genetic reproduction and hybridization. Daniel is prophesying that the final apocalyptic empire will not simply be a political coalition of human nations. It will be driven by an entity or a collective intelligence that actively attempts to replicate the great sin of Genesis 6. It is the return of the Nephilim paradigm. We do not need to look for towering 13-foot giants wielding bronze spears in the modern era to see this prophecy fulfilling itself in real time. The strategy of the enemy is far more sophisticated, adapting the illicit technology of the Watchers to the architecture of the 21st century. The original sin of the fallen angels was the erasure of the boundary between the divine and the human, the attempt to force humanity to transcend its created limitations through unauthorized, hybridized means. Today, we stand on the precipice of the exact same rebellion, repackaged as the technological singularity, the relentless, obsessive human drive toward transhumanism, the frantic desire to alter the human genome, to merge organic consciousness with artificial intelligence, and to conquer death through mechanical assimilation is not a triumph of modern science. It is the echo of the Watchers whispering from the abyss. It is the spirit of the antediluvian giants, possessing the minds of modern technologists, driving them to build a new Tower of Babel out of silicon, algorithms, and synthetic DNA. The enemy no longer needs to physically descend upon Mount Hermon to corrupt the human bloodline. They are convincing humanity to alter its own genetic code, to willingly surrender the biological signature authored by God in exchange for the false promise of digital immortality. But the esoteric manipulation of modern technology is only the precursor to the raw, supernatural devastation described in the Book of Revelation. When the Apostle John was exiled to the penal colony of Patmos, he was not subjected to a series of abstract metaphorical hallucinations. He was taken in the spirit and granted visual access to the Enochian prison system. He was allowed to see the horrific mechanical execution of the final judgment upon the entities that perished in the flood. In the 9th chapter of Revelation, the apocalypse moves from human warfare to pure, unfiltered cosmic horror. John witnesses a star fallen from heaven to earth. In the ancient biblical lexicon, a star is not a burning ball of hydrogen gas. It is the visual manifestation of an angelic being, an Elohim. This fallen entity is given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. The Greek word used by John is abyssos, the exact same subterranean, hyperdimensional void where the Apostle Peter declared the watchers were bound in chains of gloomy darkness. When this fallen angel turns the key and shatters the divine seal, the text records that smoke rises from the shaft like the smoke of a great furnace, so thick and suffocating that it darkens the sun and the sky. And out of this choking darkness, an invasive, demonic cavalry is unleashed upon the earth. John describes them using the apocalyptic imagery of locusts, but these are not biological insects. They are heavily armored, terrifying entities possessing the shapes of horses prepared for battle, with faces resembling human faces, hair like women's hair, and teeth like the fangs of lions. Their sting is like that of a scorpion, engineered not to kill humanity, but to inflict a localized, agonizing torment so severe that men will seek death and will not find it. These entities are the disembodied, ravenous spirits of the Nephilim, the bastard offspring of the Watchers, trapped in the suffocating deprivation of the abyss for thousands of years, finally released to unleash their vengeance upon the inhabitants of the earth. The text explicitly states that they are ruled by a king, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon, the destroyer. But the horror of Revelation chapter 9 does not end with the release of the demonic locusts. The chronology of the apocalypse moves to an even more devastating Enochian event. At the sounding of the sixth trumpet, a voice commands from the horns of the golden altar before God, "Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." For centuries, theologians have struggled to explain this verse using standard Orthodox doctrine. The canonical Bible never mentions 4 specific, high-ranking angels being bound at the Euphrates River at any point in human history. Good angels are not bound in chains, and the standard, generic demons of the New Testament roam freely across the arid places. So who are these 4 immensely powerful, chained entities? The Book of Enoch provides the terrifying missing context. These are the commanders of the Watcher Rebellion. The Euphrates region is the exact geographical epicenter of ancient Babylon, the very cradle of the illicit civilization built upon the forbidden knowledge of the fallen ones. The Apostle John is prophesying the literal physical release of the ancient celestial mutineers. The text states that these 4 angels have been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year, to orchestrate a mechanized slaughter that will wipe out 1/3 of mankind. They are released to lead an army of 200 million demonic cavalrymen, a mirror image of the original 200 Watchers who descended upon Hermon, scaled up to apocalyptic, civilization-ending proportions. The 70 generations of their imprisonment, as prophesied by the Archangel Michael in the Book of Enoch, are coming to an end. The sensory deprivation is over. The chains of Tartarus are snapping in the darkness. The eschaton is not merely the judgment of human sinners. It is the final violent clearing of the cosmic board. This is the ultimate context for the rise of the figure known as the Antichrist, the beast from the sea. He is not just a charismatic European diplomat or a slick political negotiator. In the 13th chapter of Revelation, the beast is described as a composite monster, possessing the biological traits of a leopard, a bear, and a lion, inheriting the throne and the absolute, terrifying authority of the dragon himself. The beast is the ultimate, localized avatar of the Nephilim spirit. He is the final Nimrod, the ultimate Gibber, empowered by the dark, territorial Elohim to establish a one-world system of absolute spiritual and economic control. His associate, the false prophet, operates by utilizing the exact same illicit technology taught by the watcher Semjaza. The scripture warns that the false prophet will perform great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of the people. This is not stage magic. It is the unauthorized manipulation of the spiritual physics of the universe, designed to deceive the inhabitants of the earth into worshipping the beast system, into taking the marker, terrifying biological and spiritual covenants that permanently alters the status of the human soul, rendering it eternally unredeemable, effectively turning humanity into the very hybrids that God drowned the earth to destroy. The modern church is woefully unprepared for the sheer supernatural violence of the coming storm. We have been lulled into a state of theological sedation, expecting a quiet, secret rapture to rescue us from a world we do not understand, while the architecture of the ancient abyss is actively groaning beneath our feet. We look at the escalating chaos of our geopolitical systems and try to apply human logic to a conflict authored by immortal, hostile intelligences. But as the prophetic timeline accelerates, the veil that separates the physical world from the terrifying reality of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is becoming dangerously thin. The territorial gods of the nations, the Kosmokrators of the present darkness, are maneuvering their human pawns for the final, desperate battle of Armageddon, a war not merely fought over land, but a suicidal rebellion against the descending armies of the Most High. The skies preparing to roll back like a scroll, and the terrifying, unvarnished truth of the Enochian cosmos is about to bleed into our reality. We walk upon the crust of this earth with an intoxicating, delusional arrogance. We build our cities of glass and steel. We split the atom. We send probes into the cold vacuum of space, and we convince ourselves that we are the masters of the universe. We look into the night sky and see a dead, silent expanse, entirely ignorant of the fact that we are merely occupying the battleground of a multidimensional war that has raged since before the foundations of the earth were laid. The ultimate triumph of the principalities and powers was not merely in their rebellion. It was in their ability to convince modern humanity that the spiritual realm is nothing more than a psychological construct, a shadow cast by the primitive minds of our ancestors. We have traded the terrifying reality of the cosmic deep for the fragile comfort of scientific materialism. But the ignorance of a prey animal does not make the predator cease to exist. It merely makes the slaughter inevitable. The tragedy of the modern religious mind is that it demands a domesticated deity. We have spent centuries constructing a theology of convenience, carving a monument to a God of perpetual affirmation who exists solely to bless our ambitions, heal our minor ailments, and guarantee our emotional comfort. But the ancient texts we have uncovered, the suppressed accounts of Enoch, the blood-soaked scrolls of Qumran, the visions of the prophets. They do not describe a cosmic therapist. They bear witness to a consuming fire. They describe an entity of such overwhelming, terrifying density, of such uncompromising holiness, that the very seraphim, the burning creatures of the divine council, must cover their faces with their wings to shield themselves from the lethal radiation of His glory. To encounter the God of antiquity is not a warm, emotional embrace. It is a traumatic, ontological shock. It is the realization that justice, in its purest form, is indistinguishable from absolute devastation. The fear of the Lord is not a metaphor for deep respect. It is the biological, terrifying realization of your own utter insignificance in the presence of uncreated, infinite power. When we truly understand the history that the early church sought to bury, the descent of the Watchers, the weaponization of illicit knowledge, the violent quarantine of the Nephilim, we are forced to confront the crushing weight of our own mortality. We are a fragile organic species, caught in the crossfire of immortal intelligences. We are not the central autonomous architects of history that we pretend to be. We are moving through a world heavily occupied by territorial entities who view our souls as currency. Entities who have spent millennia mastering the art of spiritual subjugation. The rituals of the occult, the frenzied pursuits of technological immortality, the empires built on human suffering and mechanized warfare, these are not the apex of human evolution. They are the lingering echoes of the antediluvian nightmare, the repeating patterns of a genetic and spiritual contamination that we are utterly incapable of curing on our own. The Book of Enoch and the apocalyptic visions of Patmos stand as a monument to the severity of the unseen world. They remind us that the boundaries established by the Creator are not philosophical suggestions. They are the ironclad physics of the cosmos, and the penalty for breaching those boundaries is eternal, agonizing ruin. The chains of Tartarus are real. The abyss is not a psychological state of depression. It is a geographical location within the spiritual architecture of the universe, currently holding the architects of ancient terror in suffocating sensory deprivation, waiting for the day when the heavens will be rolled back like a scroll. And on that day, there will be no philosophical debates. There will be no theological nuance. There will be no defense attorneys to argue the context of our cultural enlightenment. There will only be the sudden, terrifying exposure of the human soul to the naked, unfiltered reality of the spiritual realm. We will stand stripped of our technology, our modern skepticism, and our theological sanitizations, looking directly into the burning eyes of a jurisdiction we spent our entire lives pretending did not exist. The veil that separates this world from the next is incredibly thin, and it is tearing at the seams under the weight of our collective rebellion. The entities that drowned in the floodwaters and the princes chained in the darkness have never forgotten who they are, and they have never forgotten the war they started. The heavens are not silent, and the earth is not a sanctuary. It is a graveyard waiting for the resurrection, hovering on the edge of the abyss, suspended solely by the terrifying, unfathomable severity of a God who does not require our permission to initiate the end of the age.